"You're too old to sit with us anyway," my daughter-in-law said with a laugh at Thanksgiving dinner, and that was the moment I realized I was no longer a guest in my own home. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply stood there holding the bowl of mashed potatoes while everyone suddenly became very interested in their plates. My son Daniel cleared his throat but said nothing. Across the dining room, the soft jazz music playing from the kitchen speaker suddenly sounded too loud, too cheerful for what had just happened. I'm Margaret Holloway. I'm 71 years old, and until that evening, I believed family traditions meant something. Thanksgiving had always been my holiday. For over 30 years, I woke before sunrise to prepare the turkey, bake the pies, polish the silverware, and fill this house with the smells of butter, cinnamon, and rosemary. Even after my husband Harold passed away the previous spring, I still tried to keep everything together. I thought if I held on to the traditions tightly enough, maybe the family would hold on to me too. But grief changes people. Sometimes it reveals who they really are. The dining room looked beautiful that night. Candles flickered along the center of the table. Gold napkins rested beside expensive china Vanessa insisted on buying last year. Outside the windows, light snow drifted across the backyard, covering the garden Harold once loved in a thin blanket of white. Everything looked peaceful, warm, normal. But the empty chair at the head of the table told a different story. Harold's chair was gone. Not moved to another room. Gone completely. In its place sat a tall arrangement of fake autumn leaves Vanessa had bought from some upscale home store downtown. I noticed it the moment I walked in carrying the sweet potatoes. "Where's your father's chair?" I asked quietly. Vanessa barely glanced up from her wine glass. "We needed more space," she replied. Daniel kept cutting his turkey without looking at me. I should have understood then. I should have seen the warning hidden inside that tiny moment. But people like me are slow to accept cruelty from the people we love. "Grandma, your seat is over there," my granddaughter Emily whispered softly as I stood near the table. I followed her gaze toward the breakfast nook near the kitchen. A small folding chair sat beside the children's table where the younger cousins were already spilling cranberry sauce across paper plates. At first, I honestly thought it was a mistake. "Oh," I said gently, trying to smile. "I think someone mixed up the place cards." Vanessa laughed then. Not loudly. Just enough for everyone to hear. "No mistake, Margaret. You're too old to sit with us anyway. You said yourself you can barely hear half our conversations." A few nervous chuckles floated around the room. One of Daniel's business friends looked down awkwardly into his drink. Emily's face turned bright red with embarrassment. And my own son just sighed tiredly as if I were the one creating tension by standing there. Something inside me became very still. That's the strange thing about humiliation. It doesn't always arrive like a storm. Sometimes it enters quietly, dressed as a joke everyone else pretends is harmless. I walked to the smaller table without another word. The folding chair creaked beneath me. One of the toddlers accidentally knocked over my water glass, and Vanessa immediately snapped, "Careful around Grandma, sweetheart." Grandma. Not Mom. Not Margaret. Just Grandma. Like I was already halfway removed from the family. I stared down at the paper plate in front of me while laughter rose from the main table across the room. Daniel carved the turkey the way Harold used to. Vanessa poured wine into crystal glasses I had received for my 25th anniversary. Someone asked where the old family photo albums had gone, and Vanessa casually replied, "Oh, I packed most of that clutter away after Harold died." Clutter. 35 years of memories reduced to clutter. I felt Emily sit beside me quietly after a while. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she whispered. I didn't know she was going to do that. I smiled gently and squeezed her hand. "It's all right, sweetheart." But it wasn't all right. Not even close. Because as I looked around the room, I realized this dinner wasn't simply about a chair. It wasn't about age or hearing problems or space at the table. This had been planned. Carefully. Quietly. Deliberately. And for the first time since Harold's funeral, I began to understand something terrifying. I wasn't being included in this family anymore. I was being phased out of it. After dinner, I stayed awake long after everyone else had gone upstairs. The dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen while snow tapped gently against the windows. I sat alone at the dining room table staring at the candles that had nearly burned themselves out. The fake autumn centerpiece still sat where Harold's chair used to be. I could not stop looking at it. That empty space felt louder than the entire dinner had. For 38 years, Harold sat there every Thanksgiving carving the turkey while pretending not to notice me correcting his slices from across the table. He always cut them too thick. Every single year. And every single year he smiled when I complained about it. The silence in the room pressed against my chest until it became difficult to breathe. I finally stood up and carried the untouched pumpkin pie into the kitchen. The refrigerator was already crowded with Vanessa's expensive sparkling waters and meal prep containers neatly labeled for the week ahead. There was barely space left for the pie I had spent 4 hours baking from scratch that morning. Somehow that hurt more than it should have. This house used to feel like mine. Not because my name was on paperwork or utility bills, but because every corner carried pieces of my life inside it. The faded scratch on the hardwood floor near the staircase came from Daniel roller skating through the hallway at age 9. The kitchen ceiling still had a faint water stain Harold never quite managed to fix properly after a storm back in 1998. The rose bushes outside the dining room windows were planted the summer Daniel graduated from college. Every inch of this house held memories. But over the last 8 months, those memories had started disappearing one by one. Slowly. Quietly. Almost politely. A week after Harold's funeral, Vanessa redecorated the living room. She called it refreshing the space. The old family photographs vanished first. Then, Harold's leather chair disappeared because it looked outdated. The antique clock his parents brought from Ireland was moved into storage because it no longer matched the aesthetic. Even the kitchen changed. Vanessa replaced my handwritten recipe cards with digital meal plans displayed on a sleek white tablet mounted beside the refrigerator. She once laughed gently while explaining to one of her friends that my recipes used too much butter and belonged in another century. I pretended not to hear her. That became my role in the house after Harold died. Pretending not to notice things. Pretending not to hear the sighs whenever I entered a room. Pretending not to see Vanessa exchange looks with Daniel whenever I repeated a story or forgot where I left my reading glasses. At first, I told myself grief was affecting all of us differently. Daniel lost his father. Vanessa was trying to hold the family together in her own way. People under stress sometimes become impatient. That is what I kept telling myself. But little moments started piling up like snow during a long winter. One afternoon, I discovered the hall closet emptied of my coats and shoes. Vanessa explained they needed more storage for guests during the holidays. My belongings had been moved to the basement beside old Christmas decorations and unopened paint cans. Another time, I came downstairs one morning to find workers replacing the locks on the front door. "Just updating security," Vanessa said casually over coffee. Nobody offered me a new key until I asked for one 2 days later. Even Daniel changed after Harold passed away. Before, he used to stop by my room in the evenings just to talk. Sometimes we would sit together with tea and remember old vacations or laugh about the terrible camping trip where Harold accidentally backed the station wagon into a lake in Michigan. But those moments slowly disappeared. Daniel became distracted. Distant. Always busy with work calls or errands Vanessa needed help with. At dinner, he rarely looked directly at me anymore. It was as if acknowledging my sadness required more emotional energy than he could spare. The hardest part was how normal everyone acted while it was happening. Nobody yelled. Nobody openly told me to leave. The cruelty lived inside small decisions. Small exclusions. Small humiliations that were easy to deny if I ever dared mention them aloud. "You were imagining things, Margaret." I could almost hear Vanessa saying it already. Maybe that is why I stayed quiet for so long. Because deep down, I was terrified she might be right. Around midnight, I turned off the kitchen light and started upstairs slowly, my hand resting against the banister Harold built himself 20 years ago. Halfway up, I noticed light coming from under Emily's bedroom door. Before I could continue past it, the door opened quietly. "Grandma," she whispered. Her eyes looked worried. I forced a small smile. "You should be asleep, sweetheart." Emily hesitated before stepping into the hallway. I heard my mom talking earlier, she said softly. About you. My stomach tightened instantly. What did she say? Emily glanced nervously toward her parents' bedroom before lowering her voice even further. I do not think they want you staying here much longer. Emily's words followed me into my bedroom like a cold draft slipping beneath a locked door. I stood there for a long moment without turning on the light, my hand still resting on the brass doorknob, while the hallway behind me remained silent. At some point during the evening, the house had become unfamiliar to me. Not physically. I still recognized the wallpaper Harold picked out himself and the soft creak in the floorboards near the bathroom. But emotionally, something had shifted. The warmth was gone. I sat slowly on the edge of my bed and looked around the room Harold and I had shared for nearly 4 decades. His navy robe still hung on the back of the closet door because I could not bring myself to move it. His reading glasses remained folded neatly beside the lamp exactly where he left them the night before his heart attack. Sometimes I still caught myself listening for his footsteps in the hallway. Grief does strange things to the mind. It keeps people alive in tiny ways long after they are gone. I barely slept that night. Around 3 in the morning, I heard muffled voices downstairs. At first I thought perhaps Emily was watching television too loudly again, but then I recognized Vanessa's voice drifting faintly through the floor vents. Sharp. Irritated. I could not make out every word, only fragments. Too much space. Not practical anymore. After Christmas. Daniel answered quietly, his voice low enough that I could not hear most of it. Then Vanessa said something that made my stomach tighten instantly. You know we cannot keep living like this forever. Living like this. As though I were some difficult situation they had to manage instead of Daniel's mother. I lay awake staring at the ceiling until dawn painted pale gray light across the bedroom walls. The next morning, the house smelled faintly of coffee and cinnamon oatmeal when I walked downstairs. Vanessa stood at the kitchen island scrolling through her phone while Daniel rushed around preparing for work. Neither of them mentioned Thanksgiving dinner. Not a single apology. Not even discomfort. That hurt more than the insult itself. Cruel people sometimes reveal themselves through what they choose not to acknowledge. Morning, I said softly. Vanessa looked up briefly. There is yogurt in the fridge if you want breakfast. Yogurt. The woman who once begged for my homemade blueberry pancakes now spoke to me like an overnight guest at a hotel. Daniel grabbed his car keys from the counter. I might be home late tonight, he muttered. Still no eye contact. Your Uncle Raymond called yesterday, I said carefully. He wanted to know if we are still hosting Christmas Eve this year. Daniel hesitated only a second before Vanessa answered for him. We are thinking about simplifying things this year. Smaller gathering. Less stress for everyone. Smaller. Simpler. Less stress. Those words had become her favorite language lately. Everything connected to me suddenly required reducing, downsizing, simplifying. Even my life seemed to be quietly shrinking inside this house. After Daniel left, Vanessa disappeared upstairs for nearly an hour. I began cleaning the kitchen mostly out of habit. Harold always used to tease me for wiping counters that were already spotless. Margaret, he would laugh, one day you are going to polish the paint right off these cabinets. The memory made my chest ache unexpectedly. I opened one of the lower drawers searching for aluminum foil and froze immediately. My recipe box was gone. The old wooden box Harold carved for our 10th anniversary. The one filled with handwritten recipes stained by years of flour, butter, and holiday cooking. I checked every cabinet twice before finally hearing Vanessa descend the staircase behind me. Have you seen my recipe box? I asked quietly. Vanessa paused just long enough for me to notice. Oh, I packed some old kitchen things into storage yesterday. The drawer was cluttered. Cluttered again. That word. Those recipes belong to my mother, I said. Vanessa shrugged lightly while pouring herself coffee. I am sure they are safe somewhere downstairs. Somewhere downstairs. Like forgotten furniture. I nodded slowly and said nothing more, but something inside me was beginning to sharpen. Not anger exactly. Clarity. There is a moment in every betrayal when confusion finally gives way to understanding. Tiny details begin connecting like puzzle pieces you were too trusting to arrange before. The moved belongings. The changed locks. The disappearing family photographs. The humiliation at dinner. The quiet conversations after midnight. Suddenly it no longer felt random. Around noon, Emily came home early from meeting friends at the mall. She found me folding laundry in the family room and sat beside me silently for a few moments before speaking. "Grandma," she whispered carefully, "I think my parents are talking to a realtor." My hand stopped folding Harold's old flannel shirt. "What realtor?" Emily glanced toward the hallway nervously. "I heard Mom on the phone last week. She said something about renovations after the house is finally theirs." Finally theirs. The words settled into the room like falling ash. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily reached for my hand gently. "I do not think Grandpa would want this happening to you," she said softly. Neither did I. But for the first time since Harold died, I began wondering if perhaps my husband had known something about our family long before I did. That afternoon, after Emily left for her piano lesson, I went upstairs to Harold's old study for the first time in nearly 2 months. Vanessa had started calling it the office now, even though nobody really used it. The room still smelled faintly of cedar wood and the black coffee Harold drank every morning for most of his adult life. Winter sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, illuminating dust floating lazily in the air. I stood quietly in the doorway for a moment, suddenly overwhelmed by how much of him still lingered there. Harold had always loved this room. He spent hours inside it reading history books, organizing old receipts, or pretending to work while secretly watching baseball highlights on his tablet. Even during difficult years, this room felt steady, safe. The same could always be said about Harold himself. He was not a loud man. He did not dominate conversations or make dramatic speeches at family gatherings. But when he entered a room, people relaxed. He had that kind of presence. Calm. Reliable. Like an old oak tree standing firm through every season. I slowly crossed the room toward the bookshelf where our wedding photograph still stood tucked between 2 heavy hardcover novels. The silver frame caught the afternoon light as I picked it up carefully. We looked impossibly young in that picture. Harold's dark hair was still thick then, and I wore a lace dress my mother spent 6 months sewing by hand. We had almost no money when we got married. Harold worked double shifts at the auto plant while I waited tables at a diner off Route 7. There were winters when we could barely afford heating oil. Summers where our only vacation was sitting on the porch eating watermelon because gasoline cost too much for road trips. But somehow, those years still felt rich to me. Because everything we built together. This house especially. Harold loved reminding people that the first time we saw it, rainwater leaked through the ceiling into a bucket sitting in the middle of the hallway. Most buyers walked away immediately. Harold just smiled and said, "She has good bones." He spent 18 years repairing this place room by room. With his own hands. He refinished hardwood floors after long workdays. Rebuilt the back deck during one brutally hot July. Installed every kitchen cabinet himself while Daniel sat nearby playing with toy trucks on the floor. Sometimes I think love leaves fingerprints on places. And this house carried Harold everywhere. I sat carefully in his old leather chair and opened the bottom desk drawer out of instinct more than purpose. Inside sat neatly stacked papers, old warranty manuals, pens that no longer worked, and one small yellow envelope tucked beneath a folder. My name was written across the front in Harold's careful handwriting. Margaret. Just seeing his handwriting made my throat tighten. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a short handwritten note folded twice down the middle. "If you are reading this," it began, "then something in this house no longer feels right." I stared at the page for several seconds before continuing. "I hope I am wrong. God knows I hope I am wrong. But if anyone ever makes you feel unwanted here, I need you to remember something. This home belongs to you as much as it ever belonged to me. Do not let guilt convince you otherwise." My eyes blurred with tears instantly. Harold rarely wrote emotional things down. That made every word feel heavier somehow. There was more. "Daniel has a good heart, but good hearts can still become weak in the wrong hands. Promise me you will not disappear quietly just to keep peace in the family. You deserve dignity, Margaret. Never forget that." I pressed the note gently against my chest and closed my eyes. For months after Harold died, I kept wondering whether grief itself had changed me, whether loneliness was making me too sensitive, too suspicious. But sitting there in his chair holding that letter, I realized Harold had seen something long before I had. Maybe not specific actions. Maybe not Vanessa herself. But he understood human nature better than I ever did. Harold always noticed things I overlooked because I wanted to believe the best about people. Especially family. A soft knock startled me from my thoughts. I quickly folded the letter back into the envelope just as Daniel stepped into the doorway. He looked uncomfortable immediately upon seeing me in the study. "Oh," he muttered awkwardly. "I did not know you were in here." "I was just looking through some of your father's things," I replied gently. Daniel nodded without entering fully into the room. His tie hung loose around his neck, and dark circles sat beneath his eyes. For a moment, he looked like the exhausted little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. "Vanessa says you have been upset lately," he said carefully. "Upset lately." Such clean words for something so painful. "Have I?" I asked quietly. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "She thinks maybe the house feels too big for you now. Too much responsibility." There it was again. The same language. Prepared. Rehearsed. Too big. Too much. I studied my son's face for a long moment before answering. "Did your father ever tell you what this house meant to him?" Daniel looked confused by the question. "Not really." I smiled faintly then, though sadness sat heavy beneath it. "That is interesting," I said softly. "Because he told me everything." Daniel stood there for another moment as though he wanted to say something else, but instead he only nodded awkwardly and disappeared down the hallway. I listened to his footsteps fade toward the kitchen before carefully slipping Harold's letter back into the envelope. My hands trembled slightly, though not from fear anymore. Something inside me had begun settling into place. Quietly. Firmly. Like the final piece of a puzzle sliding where it belonged. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to the house around me. Not emotionally this time. Logically. I noticed how often Vanessa whispered on the phone when she thought nobody could hear her. How quickly conversations stopped whenever I entered a room. How certain drawers in the kitchen suddenly remained locked. It was strange. Once you stop trying to explain away people's behavior, patterns become impossible to ignore. Monday morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. A thin layer of ice coated the front porch railings while dead leaves scraped softly across the driveway in the wind. I woke early and decided to bake cinnamon bread, mostly because the house still felt more familiar when it smelled like something warm. Harold always loved cinnamon bread in winter. He used to toast thick slices and drown them in butter while pretending his doctor had never warned him about cholesterol. I had just taken the second loaf from the oven when I heard unfamiliar voices downstairs. Male voices. Professional. Measured. Curious. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and stepped carefully toward the foyer. Through the staircase railing, I saw Vanessa leading a tall man through the living room while another woman stood near the fireplace typing notes into a tablet. The tall man wore an expensive charcoal overcoat and polished brown shoes that clicked lightly against the hardwood floor. Realtor shoes. The realization settled coldly in my stomach. "Natural lighting is excellent in here," the woman said while glancing toward the dining room. Vanessa smiled brightly. "The kitchen was updated recently too. The open layout photographs beautifully." Photographs beautifully. My fingers tightened around the dish towel. They were not discussing possibilities anymore. They were preparing. I stepped fully into the hallway then, and all three of them froze briefly. Vanessa recovered first. "Margaret," she said smoothly, though irritation flashed quickly across her face. "You were up early." The man offered a polite smile and extended his hand. "Brian Keller. We are just doing an informal walkthrough." Informal walkthrough. Such harmless-sounding words. "Of my house?" I asked quietly. Vanessa gave a small laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Nobody is selling anything yet. We are only exploring future options." Future options. More careful language. Always careful. The realtor quickly sensed tension and excused himself toward the backyard patio doors with his assistant. Vanessa folded her arms loosely once they were out of earshot. "You really should not jump to conclusions, Margaret." Should I not? I asked softly. Her expression hardened slightly. This house is enormous for one person your age. Daniel and I are thinking practically. That is all. There it was again. Practical. As though love, memory, loyalty, and grief could all be solved with practical decisions. I looked past her toward the dining room where Harold's chair one Saturday. Did Daniel invite them? Vanessa hesitated barely a second too long. Of course he did. But something in her tone felt rehearsed. That afternoon, after the realtor left, I drove to the small storage facility on the edge of town where Vanessa claimed my belongings had been moved. The December wind cut sharply across the parking lot as I unlocked the metal unit assigned to our family. Inside, cardboard boxes were stacked from floor to ceiling beneath harsh fluorescent lights. Christmas decorations. Old furniture. Camping equipment Daniel had not touched in years. I found my recipe box buried near the back beside several framed family photographs wrapped in newspaper. Every single picture included Harold and me. None included Vanessa. I sat on an overturned crate for a long time staring at those photographs while cold air slipped through the edges of the storage door. There we were at Niagara Falls in 1986, wearing matching blue windbreakers. There was Daniel holding his first baseball glove while Harold knelt proudly beside him. Another photo showed me laughing in this very kitchen 20 years younger, with flour on my cheek and Thanksgiving pies cooling behind me. They were not storing clutter. They were storing evidence that this house belonged to someone before Vanessa arrived. On my way home, my phone rang through the car speakers. Emily. Grandma? Her voice sounded nervous again. Mom is meeting someone tomorrow morning while Dad is at work. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. Who? I do not know. But I heard her say something about paperwork and signatures. Paperwork. Signatures. The words echoed unpleasantly in my chest all the way home. That evening, after everyone went upstairs, I returned quietly to Harold's study carrying the box of photographs from storage. Snow drifted heavily outside now, covering the backyard in silence. I opened Harold's desk again, searching not for comfort this time, but answers. And tucked beneath an old insurance folder in the back corner of the bottom drawer, I found a brass key. Attached to a faded label written in Harold's handwriting. Safe deposit box. First National Bank. The next morning, I left the house before sunrise for the first time in months, without telling anyone where I was going. The December air stung my face as I carried my purse across the driveway toward Harold's old Buick. Frost coated the windshield in thin silver patterns, and for a moment I stood there shivering, staring back at the house. Upstairs, the bedroom lights were still off. Everything looked peaceful from the outside. Quiet suburban perfection. Nobody driving past our street would ever guess how cold that house had become inside. The bank sat downtown beside an old pharmacy and a coffee shop Harold used to love. First National Bank had not changed much in 30 years. Same marble floors. Same brass railings. Same faint smell of paper and polished wood. Walking through those front doors felt strangely comforting, like stepping briefly into a version of life that still made sense. A young teller greeted me politely and directed me toward one of the private offices after I explained about the safe deposit box. Within minutes, an older gentleman wearing glasses stepped into the room carrying a clipboard. The moment he saw my face, his expression softened immediately. Mrs. Holloway, he said warmly. I am Richard Ellis. I handled several accounts for your husband over the years. I nodded politely. I found a key last night. He glanced down at the brass key resting in my palm, and his face changed almost imperceptibly. Recognition. I see, he said quietly. Please follow me. The vault room sat beneath the main floor behind a heavy steel door that looked like something from another era. Richard unlocked the safe deposit box carefully and placed it on a small private table before excusing himself. Take all the time you need, he said gently. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the box. Inside sat several neatly organized folders, a small velvet jewelry pouch, and one sealed envelope marked in Harold's handwriting. For Margaret only. I opened the envelope first. If you are reading this, Harold wrote, then things have unfolded exactly the way I feared. They might. My throat tightened instantly. I did not want to believe Daniel would ever allow anyone to make you feel unwanted in your own home. But love can cloud judgment, especially when mixed with guilt and ambition. I needed to make sure you would never stand alone if that day came. Beneath the letter sat copies of legal documents I did not fully understand at first. Trust agreements, property records, financial statements. I stared at page after page while confusion slowly turned into disbelief. The house was not entirely in Daniel's name the way Vanessa clearly believed. Harold had placed the property years earlier into an irrevocable family trust managed by a third party. And buried deep within the documents sat a clause highlighted carefully in yellow marker. If Margaret Holloway is pressured, manipulated, or emotionally coerced into surrendering residency rights within the family home, primary inheritance privileges shall be suspended pending trustee review. Suspended. My heart pounded heavily as I kept reading. In plain English, it meant Daniel could lose access to a significant portion of Harold's estate if I were forced out unfairly. Harold had protected me. Quietly. Completely. I sat frozen in that small room for several minutes staring at the papers while memories rushed painfully through my mind. Harold sitting quietly at the kitchen table late at night balancing checkbooks. Harold insisting we meet with attorneys every few years even when I told him it was unnecessary. Harold always noticing dangers before I did. There was one final page clipped beneath the others. A business card. Arthur Bennett. Estate attorney. Of course. Harold trusted Arthur with everything. They had been friends since college. I remembered now how often the two of them disappeared into the study after dinner talking quietly for hours while drinking terrible whiskey neither of them could really tolerate anymore. My chest tightened with sudden emotion. Even after death, Harold was still trying to protect me. Richard knocked softly before entering the room again. Mrs. Holloway? I looked up slowly. Did your husband know something was going to happen? Richard hesitated carefully before answering. Your husband was a very intelligent man. He believed preparation was not the same thing as distrust. I nodded silently. That sounded exactly like Harold. Before leaving the bank, I asked Richard for directions to Arthur Bennett's office downtown. Snow had started falling again by then, covering parked cars and sidewalks in soft white layers. Arthur's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking Main Street. The receptionist smiled politely when I introduced myself, then disappeared into the back office. Less than 10 seconds later, Arthur himself appeared in the doorway. His face went pale with surprise. Margaret, he breathed softly. Oh my God. He looked older than I remembered. Thinner too. But his eyes remained kind. He guided me into his office personally and closed the door behind us. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I placed Harold's letter and the trust documents carefully onto his desk. Arthur stared down at them heavily before removing his glasses. I hoped you would never need to see these, he said quietly. So did Harold. I sat very still across from him while snow drifted silently outside the office windows. Arthur, I asked softly, exactly how much did my husband know? Arthur looked at me for a very long moment before answering. Enough to worry that one day you might be treated as temporary inside the home you helped build. Arthur leaned back heavily in his chair after speaking, his expression weighed down by something deeper than simple sympathy. Outside the office windows, snow continued drifting across Main Street while Christmas decorations blinked softly along the sidewalks below. The entire town looked peaceful, warm. But inside that office, I felt as though the ground beneath my life had shifted permanently. Harold came to see me 3 years ago, Arthur said quietly after a long silence. Long before his health started declining. I folded my hands carefully in my lap. What did he say? Arthur removed his glasses slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose before answering. He told me he was worried you trusted people too easily. The words should have hurt. Instead, they felt painfully accurate. Harold used to joke that I could find goodness in almost anyone if given enough time. Maybe that had once been a strength. Lately, it felt more like a weakness people quietly exploited. Arthur opened one of the folders again and slid several pages toward me. The trust protects your right to remain in the home permanently, he explained. Nobody can legally pressure you into leaving without consequences. I stared down at the paperwork while my pulse steadied little by little. For the first time in months, fear was beginning to loosen its grip on me. Not because the situation hurt any less, but because uncertainty had finally been replaced by truth. And truth, even painful truth, carries a strange kind of peace. Does Daniel know about any of this? I asked softly. Arthur shook his head. Harold specifically requested these documents remain private unless circumstances required otherwise. Of course he did. Harold never believed in humiliating people publicly. Even when preparing for betrayal, he still tried protecting Daniel's dignity. That realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself. I left Arthur's office carrying copies of the trust documents inside my purse along with a heaviness I could not quite describe. Grief changes shape over time. At first it arrives loudly, crashing through every room of your life. Later, it becomes quieter, colder, more thoughtful. By the time I drove home, evening darkness had already settled across the neighborhood. Christmas lights glowed softly along nearby rooftops, while smoke drifted from chimneys into the freezing air. Families inside those homes were probably decorating cookies or arguing gently over wrapping paper. Ordinary things. Precious things. I sat in the driveway for a long moment before going inside. The house was unusually loud when I entered. Vanessa stood in the dining room directing two movers who carried boxes toward the basement staircase. Large rolls of decorative ribbon and artificial garland covered the dining table. Christmas music played from the kitchen speaker. Everything looked festive at first glance. Until I noticed the labels on the boxes. Master. Bedroom storage. Harold study items. Family archives. My chest tightened instantly. What is all this? I asked quietly. Vanessa barely looked up from her clipboard. We are reorganizing before Christmas guests arrive. Reorganizing. Another harmless word hiding something ugly underneath. One of the movers brushed past me carrying a box filled with framed photographs. I recognized the silver wedding portrait from our 20th anniversary sitting carelessly near the top beneath tangled extension cords. Please be careful with those, I said instinctively. Vanessa sighed dramatically. Margaret, they are only pictures. Only pictures. The sentence echoed painfully through me. Not because of the photographs themselves, but because of how easily she dismissed the life connected to them. Daniel entered from the kitchen holding a coffee mug just as the movers disappeared downstairs again. He looked exhausted. Older somehow. Hey, Mom, he muttered distractedly. We are trying to get things organized before everyone comes over Christmas week. Everyone. Such an interesting word considering how invisible I had become inside my own family. I noticed, I replied softly. Vanessa crossed her arms while studying me carefully. Actually, she said, Daniel and I wanted to talk to you about something tonight. There it was. The conversation Emily had warned me about. My heartbeat slowed strangely instead of quickening. Calm settled over me in an unfamiliar way. Perhaps because I finally understood something they did not. I was no longer trapped inside confusion. We sat around the kitchen island an hour later while snow fell steadily outside. Vanessa placed a glossy brochure gently in front of me like a waitress delivering dessert. Sunnybrook Senior Living Community. The smiling elderly couple on the cover sat holding hands beside a lake while younger staff members laughed nearby. Everything about it looked painfully artificial. It is a beautiful place, Vanessa said carefully. They have private apartments, social activities, transportation services. It might actually make life easier for you. Easier for you. Daniel stared down into his coffee cup without speaking. I picked up the brochure slowly. You have already visited there? Vanessa smiled tightly. We thought it was important to explore healthy options. Healthy options. Another carefully chosen phrase. Your mother deserves comfort, she added while glancing toward Daniel for support. Finally, my son spoke. Maybe it would help having people around your own age, Mom. Your own age. The same language as Thanksgiving dinner. Small words. Small cuts. Death by paper instead of knives. I closed the brochure gently and placed it back onto the counter. Did either of you ever stop to wonder whether this house still feels like home to me because your father is still here? Silence filled the kitchen instantly. Vanessa's expression hardened. Daniel looked away. Grief is not healthy when it turns into attachment, Vanessa said coolly. Attachment. As though 38 years of marriage were some emotional bad habit I needed treatment for. And in that exact moment, as Christmas lights reflected softly across the kitchen windows, I realized something important. Vanessa believed this conversation was the beginning of my surrender. But she had absolutely no idea it was actually the beginning of hers. The days leading up to Christmas passed beneath a strange layer of artificial cheerfulness inside the house. Vanessa filled every corner with decorations as though enough ribbon and pine garland could disguise the tension growing beneath the surface. The staircase wrapped in gold lights. Crystal bowls filled with peppermint candies placed carefully throughout the living room. Soft instrumental carols playing from morning until bedtime. Anyone visiting would have thought we were preparing for the perfect family holiday. But underneath the music and decorations, the house felt colder than ever. After our conversation about Sunnybrook, something changed inside me permanently. I stopped apologizing for existing. Quietly. Invisibly. I no longer rushed upstairs whenever Vanessa entertained guests. I no longer pretended not to hear conversations abruptly ending when I entered rooms. And strangely, the calmer I became, the more irritated Vanessa seemed to grow. It was almost as if my silence unsettled her more than arguments ever could. One afternoon, I found her standing in the kitchen staring at me while I kneaded dough for Christmas rolls. "You seem different lately," she said carefully. I continued working the dough without looking up. "Do I?" "Calmer," she replied. "I thought you would be more emotional about everything." Emotional. Another interesting word. Women like Vanessa always expected older women to collapse gracefully under pressure. Tears. Begging. Confusion. Instead, I simply folded the dough slowly beneath my hands while cinnamon drifted warmly through the kitchen. "Your father used to say panic clouds judgment," I answered softly. Vanessa studied me for several seconds before leaving the room without another word. That evening, Emily knocked quietly on my bedroom door carrying a mug of hot chocolate topped with too many marshmallows, exactly the way Harold used to make it for her every Christmas Eve. "Mom has been acting weird all day," she whispered while sitting beside me on the bed. I smiled faintly. "Your mother has always acted weird around me." Emily laughed softly before her expression turned serious again. "Grandma, I heard Dad arguing with her downstairs earlier." That caught my attention immediately. "About what?" "Money, I think. Mom kept saying everything was supposed to happen faster." Faster. The word settled heavily in my mind long after Emily returned downstairs. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, I stood quietly outside Harold's old study listening to the faint hum of the heating vents through the dark hallway. For months, I avoided confronting the reality of what was happening because part of me still wanted to protect Daniel from my suspicions. Mothers are foolish that way sometimes. We spend decades loving our children so deeply that even their worst betrayals feel easier to blame on someone else. But now I could finally see the truth clearly. Vanessa may have guided things, manipulated things, encouraged things. But Daniel had still allowed it all to happen. That realization hurt more than anything else. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in heavy snowfall. By late afternoon, the house filled with relatives carrying wrapped gifts, bottles of wine, and trays of cookies dusted with powdered sugar. Laughter echoed through the living room while children chased each other around the tree. Everything looked almost normal again. Almost. But I noticed something immediately. Vanessa had rearranged the seating chart for dinner once more. My place card sat at the far end of the table beside the hallway entrance, while Daniel and Vanessa occupied the center seats beneath the chandelier where Harold and I used to sit every year. Tiny humiliations. Tiny territorial victories. The kind cruel people prefer because they remain easy to deny publicly. During dinner, Vanessa performed kindness beautifully for the guests. She complimented everyone's sweaters, refreshed wine glasses before anyone asked, even touched my shoulder gently once while asking if I needed extra gravy. Watching her was like watching someone play a role they had rehearsed carefully. But beneath the performance, tension flickered constantly in her eyes whenever she looked at me. Halfway through dessert, she finally made her move. "Margaret," she announced brightly enough for the entire table to hear, Daniel and I actually have exciting news." Conversations quieted immediately around the room. Daniel looked uncomfortable beside her. Vanessa smiled wider. "We have been discussing some positive changes for the family next year. Fresh starts. Simplifying life." There were those words again. Fresh starts. Simplifying. I sat quietly folding my napkin in my lap while relatives exchanged polite smiles. "We are helping Margaret explore retirement community options," Vanessa continued smoothly. "Somewhere with social activities and less maintenance." The room went still. Emily immediately lowered her fork with a sharp clatter against her plate. Across the table, Daniel stared fixedly at his wine glass without speaking. "Sunnybrook has beautiful lake views," Vanessa added with practiced enthusiasm. "And people her own age to spend time with." Her own age. Again. The implication hung heavily over the table. Too old. Too inconvenient. Too much. One of Daniel's cousins shifted awkwardly in his chair before, muttering something about needing more coffee. Nobody met my eyes. Shame moves quickly through rooms like that. Not the shame of the person being humiliated. The shame of everyone else witnessing it and doing nothing. I placed my napkin carefully beside my dessert plate and finally looked directly at Vanessa for the first time all evening. And then something happened she clearly did not expect. I smiled. Not bitterly. Not angrily. Calmly. The exact same smile Harold used to wear whenever he already knew the outcome of an argument before anyone else did. Vanessa's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. Confusion. Just for a second. "That sounds lovely," I said softly. "In fact, I think it is time we all had a very important family conversation soon." Daniel finally looked up then. Something uncertain moved across his face. But Vanessa only smiled tighter, believing she was still controlling the room. Poor girl. She had absolutely no idea that Harold had already prepared the final conversation months before any of this began. The morning after Christmas Eve arrived strangely quiet. Snow covered the neighborhood in thick white silence, softening the roads and burying the sidewalks beneath untouched drifts. For the first time in months, I woke feeling calm. Not happy. Not triumphant. Simply calm. There is a certain peace that comes when fear finally disappears. Downstairs, the house still smelled faintly of pine needles, cinnamon candles, and the remains of yesterday's dinner. Wrapping paper overflowed from trash bags near the fireplace, while half-empty coffee mugs sat abandoned throughout the living room. The aftermath of family gatherings always used to make me sentimental. Harold loved mornings like this. He used to sit by the window drinking coffee while quietly admiring the mess, because to him it meant family had filled the house with life. But now the room felt hollow despite all the evidence people had been there. Around 9 o'clock, I called Arthur Bennett. "It is time," I said simply when he answered. He paused only briefly before replying, "I understand." By noon, everyone had gathered in the dining room again. Vanessa assumed I was finally ready to discuss retirement plans seriously. I could see it in the way she carefully arranged papers beside her seat at the table. Brochures from Sunnybrook. Housing estimates. Notes written neatly in blue ink. She wore a cream-colored sweater and pearls as though preparing for a business meeting rather than dismantling someone's life. Daniel looked exhausted. He barely touched his coffee while staring blankly toward the snow outside. Emily sat quietly beside me, her expression tense. Then the front doorbell rang. Vanessa frowned immediately. "Are we expecting someone?" she asked. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "Yes," I answered softly. "We are." Arthur entered moments later carrying a leather briefcase dusted lightly with snowflakes. The moment Daniel saw him, confusion crossed his face. Vanessa's posture stiffened instantly. "Arthur," Daniel said cautiously. "What is going on?" Arthur removed his gloves slowly before taking a seat at the table. "Your father asked me to attend this conversation if certain circumstances ever developed." The room became very still. Vanessa attempted a polite smile, though tension already crept into her voice. "I think there must be some misunderstanding. Margaret and Daniel were simply discussing future living arrangements." Arthur opened his briefcase without reacting. "Actually," he replied evenly, "Mr. Holloway anticipated that exact discussion." Daniel finally looked directly at me then, uncertainty beginning to spread visibly across his face. "Mom," he asked quietly. I met my son's eyes calmly. "Your father knew this house might someday stop feeling like home for me." Vanessa let out a small nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous. Nobody has done anything wrong." Arthur slid several legal documents across the dining table carefully. "The Holloway family trust states otherwise." Silence followed. Heavy. Suffocating. Arthur adjusted his glasses before continuing. Approximately 6 years ago, Harold Holloway transferred ownership protections of this property into an irrevocable trust structure. Vanessa's expression shifted immediately. Confusion first, then concern. "What does that mean exactly?" she asked sharply. Arthur's voice remained calm and precise. "It means this home cannot be sold, transferred, or reassigned while Margaret Holloway maintains residency rights." Daniel blinked slowly. "Wait. I thought Dad left the house to me." Arthur nodded once. "Eventually. Under specific conditions." Vanessa leaned forward abruptly. "Conditions?" Arthur turned another page toward them. One condition being that Margaret Holloway must never be emotionally pressured, manipulated, or coerced into surrendering her residency within the family home. The color drained visibly from Vanessa's face. Daniel stared silently at the paperwork as though reading a foreign language. Arthur continued carefully. "If such coercion occurs, inheritance privileges connected to the property become suspended pending trustee review. In extreme cases, portions of the estate may instead transfer to charitable organizations designated by Harold Holloway." Nobody spoke. Even the heating vents seemed to fall silent inside the room. Vanessa finally found her voice first. "This is insane," she whispered. "We were only trying to help her." Arthur folded his hands calmly atop the table. Suggesting assisted living privately is one thing. Public humiliation, property preparation, realtor consultations, and documented pressure tactics create a very different legal picture. Daniel's head lifted sharply. "Realtor consultations?" he asked slowly, turning toward Vanessa. She froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. "Vanessa?" Daniel's voice cracked softly beneath the weight of sudden realization. She immediately straightened defensively. "I was planning ahead for us. For our future. Our future. Not his mother's. Not the family's. Hers." Emily quietly reached for my hand beneath the table. I could feel her fingers trembling. Daniel looked devastated now. Truly devastated. Like a man waking suddenly from a dream he no longer recognized. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely, "why did you not tell me?" I looked at my son for a very long moment before answering. "Because I kept waiting for you to notice on your own." The pain that crossed his face then reminded me painfully of the little boy who used to cry whenever he disappointed Harold. But this was no longer a child sitting before me. This was a grown man who had allowed weakness, comfort, and silence to slowly replace loyalty. Vanessa suddenly stood from the table. "This is manipulation," she snapped. "She turned all of you against me." Arthur closed the folder calmly. "No, Mrs. Holloway." Harold simply prepared for the possibility that one day his wife might no longer be treated with dignity inside her own home. Vanessa's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. And for the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, the house finally felt quiet in a different way. Not cold. Not hostile. Honest.